What's up, folks? I'm Dan, and welcome to I've Been Meaning to Read That, the show where I read books out loud that I've been meaning to read. Let's go. You know how your teachers say that there's no such thing as a stupid question? There is. There definitely is. We all knew that. One girl today raised her hand during our science class where we were talking about the endocrine system. And she asked, "What about those people who don't eat food?" I said, "What?" And she said, they're just breathing. They just breathe air. And I said, "What?" So that is the kind of day that I've been having. And that means I am very excited to read some classic literature. So let's get back to our story. Chapter 16, A Learned Italian. Seizing in his arms the friend so long and ardently desired, Dantes almost carried him towards the window in order to obtain a better view of his features by the aid of the imperfect light that struggled through the grating. He was a man of small stature, with hair blanched rather by suffering and sorrow than by age. He had a deep-set, penetrating eye, almost buried beneath a thick gray eyebrow, and a long and still black beard reaching down to his breast. His thin face, deeply furrowed by care, and the bold outline of his strongly marked features betokened a man more accustomed to exercise his mental faculties than his physical strength. Large drops of perspiration were now standing on his brow, while the garments that hung about him were so ragged that one could only guess at the pattern upon which they had originally been fashioned. The stranger might have numbered 60 or 65 years, but a certain briskness and appearance of vigor in his movements made it probable that he was aged more from captivity than the course of time. He received the enthusiastic greeting of his young acquaintance with evident pleasure, as though his chilled affections were rekindled and invigorated by his contact with one so warm and ardent. He thanked him with grateful cordiality for his kindly welcome, although he must at that moment have been suffering bitterly to find another dungeon where he had fondly reckoned on discovering a means of regaining his liberty. "Let us first see," said he, "whether it is possible to remove the traces of my entrance here. Our future tranquillity depends upon our jailers being entirely ignorant of it." Advancing to the opening, he stooped and raised the stone easily in spite of its weight. Then, fitting it into its place, he said, "You removed this stone very carelessly, but I suppose you had no tools to aid you." "Why," exclaimed Dantes with astonishment, "do you possess any?" "I made myself some, and with the exception of a file, I have all that are necessary: a chisel, pincers, and lever." "Oh, how I should like to see these products of your industry and patience." "Well, in the first place, here is my chisel." So saying, he displayed a sharp, strong blade with a handle made of beechwood. "And with what did you contrive to make that?" inquired Dantes. "With one of the clamps of my bedstead, and this very tool has sufficed to hollow out the road by which I came hither, a distance of about 50 feet. 50 feet? Responded Dantes, almost terrified. "Do not speak so loud, young man. Don't speak so loud. It frequently occurs in a state prison like this that persons are stationed outside the doors of the cells purposely to hear the conversation of the prisoners." "But they believe I am shut up alone in here." "That makes no difference." "And you say that you dug your way a distance of 50 feet to get here?" "I do. That is about the distance that separates your chamber from mine. Only, unfortunately, I did not curve aright, for want of the necessary geometrical instruments to calculate my scale of proportion. Instead of taking an ellipsis of 40 feet, I made it 50. I expected, as I told you, to reach the outer wall, pierce through it, and throw myself into the sea. I have, however, kept along the corridor on which your chamber opens, instead of going beneath it. My labor is all in vain, for I find that the corridor looks into a courtyard filled with soldiers." "That's true," said Dantes. "But the corridor you speak of only bounds one side of my cell. There are 3 others. Do you know anything of their situation?" This one is built against a solid rock, and it would take 10 experienced miners, duly furnished with the requisite tools, as many years to perforate it. This adjoins the lower part of the governor's apartments, and were we to work our way through, we should only get into some lock-up cellars, where we must necessarily be recaptured. The fourth and last side of your cell faces on... Stop a minute. Now where does it face? The wall of which he spoke was the one in which was fixed the loophole by which light was admitted to the chamber. This loophole, which gradually diminished in size as it approached the outside, to an opening through which a child could not have passed, was, for better security, furnished with 3 iron bars, so as to quiet all apprehensions, even in the mind of the most suspicious jailer, as to the possibility of a prisoner's escape. As the stranger asked the question, he dragged the table beneath the window. "Climb up," said he to Dantès. The young man obeyed, mounted on the table, and, divining the wishes of his companion, placed his back securely against the wall and held out both hands. The stranger, whom as yet Dantès knew only by the number of his cell, sprang up with an agility by no means to be expected in a person of his years, and, light and steady on his feet as a cat or a lizard, climbed from the table to the outstretched hands of Dantès, and from them to his shoulders. Then, bending double, for the ceiling of the dungeon prevented him from holding himself erect, he managed to slip his head between the upper bars of the window, so as to be able to command a perfect view from top to bottom. An instant afterwards he hastily drew back his head, saying, "I thought so," and sliding from the shoulders of Dantès as dexterously as he had ascended, he nimbly leapt from the table to the ground. "What was it you thought?" asked the young man anxiously, in his turn descending from the table. The elder prisoner pondered the matter. "Yes," said he at length, "it is so. This side of your chamber looks out upon a kind of open gallery, where patrols are continually passing, and sentries keep watch day and night." "Are you quite sure of that?" "Certain. I saw the soldier's shape and the top of his musket. That made me draw on my head so quickly, for I was fearful he might also see me." "Well?" inquired Dantès. "You perceive, then, the utter impossibility of escaping through your dungeon?" "Then," pursued the young man eagerly, "then," answered the elder prisoner, "the will of God be done." And as the old man slowly pronounced those words, an air of profound resignation spread itself over his careworn countenance. Dantès gazed on the man who could thus philosophically resign hopes so long and ardently nourished, with an astonishment mingled with admiration. "Tell me, I entreat of you, who and what you are," said he at length. "Never have I met with so remarkable a person as yourself." "Willingly," answered the stranger, "if, indeed, you feel any curiosity respecting one, now, alas, powerless to aid you in any way." "Say not so. You can console and support me by the strength of your own powerful mind. Pray, let me know who you really are." The stranger smiled a melancholy smile. "Then listen," said he. "I am the Abbé Faria, and have been imprisoned, as you know, in this Château d'If since the year 1811, previously to which I had been confined for 3 years in the fortress of Fenestrelle. In the year 1811, I was transferred to Piedmont in France. It was at this period that I learned that destiny, which seemed subservient to every wish formed by Napoleon, had bestowed on him a son, named King of Rome even in his cradle. I was very far then from expecting the change you have just informed me of, namely that 4 years afterwards this colossus of power would be overthrown. Then, who reigns in France at this moment? Napoleon II? No, Louis XVIII. The brother of Louis XVI? How inscrutable are the ways of Providence! For what great and mysterious purpose has it pleased heaven to abase a man once so elevated, and raise up him who was so abased?" Dante's whole attention was riveted on a man who could thus forget his own misfortunes while occupying himself with the destinies of others. "You know, yes, continued he, 'twill be the same as it was in England. After Charles I, Cromwell, after Cromwell, Charles II, and then James II, and then some son-in-law relation, some Prince of Orange, a stadtholder who becomes a king. Then new concessions to the people, then a constitution, then liberty. Ah, my friend, said the abbé, turning towards Dantes and surveying him with the kindling gaze of a prophet. You are young, you will see all this come to pass. Probably, if ever I get out of prison. True, replied Faria. We are prisoners, but I forget this sometimes, and there are even moments when my mental vision transports me beyond these walls, and I fancy myself at liberty. But wherefore are you here? Because in 1807 I dreamed of the very plan Napoleon tried to realize in 1811. Because, like Machiavelli, I desire to alter the political face of Italy, and instead of allowing it to be split up into the quantity of petty principalities, each held by some weak or tyrannical ruler, I sought to form one large, compact, and powerful empire. And lastly, because I fancied I had found my Caesar Borgia in a crowned simpleton who feigned to enter into my views only to betray me. It was the plan of Alexander VI and Clement VII, but it will never succeed now, for they attempted it fruitlessly, and Napoleon was unable to complete his work. Italy seems fated to misfortune. And the old man bowed his head. Dantes could not understand a man risking his life for such matters. Napoleon certainly he knew something of, inasmuch as he had seen and spoken with him, but of Clement VII and Alexander VI he knew nothing. Are you not, he asked, the priest who here in the Chateau d'If is generally thought to be ill? Mad, you mean, don't you? I did not like to say so, answered Dantes, smiling. Well then, resumed Feria with a bitter smile, let me answer your question in full by acknowledging that I am the poor mad prisoner of the Chateau d'If, for many years permitted to amuse the different visitors with what is said to be my insanity. And, in all probability, I should be promoted to the honor of making sport for the children, if such innocent beings could be found in an abode devoted like this to suffering and despair. Dantes remained for a short time mute and motionless. At length he said, Then you abandon all hope of escape? I perceive its utter impossibility, and I consider it impious to attempt that which the Almighty evidently does not approve. Nay, be not discouraged. Would it not be expecting too much to hope to succeed at your first attempt? Why not try to find an opening in another direction from that which has so unfortunately failed? Alas, it shows how little notion you can have of all it has cost me to effect a purpose so unexpectedly frustrated that you talk of beginning over again. In the first place, I was 4 years making the tools I possess, and have been 2 years scraping and digging out earth hard as granite itself. Then what toil and fatigue has it not been to remove huge stones I should once have deemed impossible to loosen? Whole days have I passed in these titanic efforts, considering my labor well repaid if, by night time, I had contrived to carry away a square inch of this hard-bound cement, changed by ages into a substance unyielding as the stones themselves. Then, to conceal the mass of earth and rubbish I dug up, I was compelled to break through a staircase, and now throw the fruits of my labor into the hollow part of it. But the well is now so completely choked up that I scarcely think it would be possible to add another handful of dust without leading to discovery. Consider also that I fully believed I had accomplished the end and aim of my undertaking, for which I had so exactly husbanded my strength as to make it just hold out to the termination of my enterprise. And now, at the moment when I reckoned upon success, my hopes are forever dashed from me. No, I repeat again, that nothing shall induce me to renew attempts evidently at variance with the Almighty's pleasure. Dantes held down his head, that the other might not see how joy at the thought of having a companion outweighed the sympathy he felt for the failure of the abbé's plans. The abbé sank upon Edmund's bed, while Edmund himself remained standing. Escape had never once occurred to him. There are, indeed, some things which appear so impossible that the mind does not dwell on them for an instant. To undermine the ground for 50 feet, to devote 3 years to a labor which, if successful, would conduct you to a precipice overhanging the sea, to plunge into the waves from the height of 50, 60, perhaps 100 feet, at the risk of being dashed to pieces against the rocks, should you have been fortunate enough to have escaped the fire of the sentinels, and even, supposing all these perils past, then to have to swim for your life a distance of at least 3 miles ere you could reach the shore, were difficulties so startling and formidable that Dantes had never even dreamed of such a scheme, resigning himself rather to death. But the sight of an old man clinging to life with so desperate a courage gave a fresh turn to his ideas and inspired him with new courage. Another, older and less strong than he, had attempted what he had not sufficient resolution to undertake, and had failed only because of an error in calculation. This same person, with almost incredible patience and perseverance, had contrived to provide himself with tools requisite for so unparalleled an attempt. Another had done all this. Why, then, was it impossible to Dantes? Faria had dug his way through 50 feet. Dantes would dig 100. Faria, at the age of 50, had devoted 3 years to the task. He, who was but half as old, would sacrifice 6. Faria, a priest and savant, had not shrunk from the idea of risking his life by trying to swim a distance of 3 miles to one of the islands, Daume, Ratonneau, or Le Maire. Should a hardy sailor, an experienced diver like himself, shrink from a similar task? Should he, who had so often, for mere amusement's sake, plunged to the bottom of the sea to fetch up the bright coral branch, hesitate to entertain the same project? He could do it in an hour. And how many times had he, for pure pastime, continued in the water for more than twice as long? At once, Dantes resolved to follow the brave example of his energetic companion, and to remember that what has been done once may be done again. After continuing some time in profound meditation, the young man suddenly exclaimed, "I have found what you are in search of."
"Have you indeed?" cried Faria, raising his head with quick anxiety. "Pray, let me know what it is you have discovered."
"The corridor through which you have bored your way from the cell you occupy here extends in the same direction as the outer gallery, does it not?"
"It does."
"And is not above 15 feet from it?"
"About that."
"Well then, I will tell you what we must do. We must pierce through the corridor by forming a side opening through the middle, as if it were the top part of a cross. This time, you will lay your plans more accurately. We shall get out into the gallery you have described, kill the sentinel who guards it, and make our escape. All we require to ensure success is courage, and that you possess, and strength, which I am not deficient in. As for patience, you have abundantly proved yours. You shall now see me prove mine."
"One instant, my dear friend," replied the abbé. "It is clear you do not understand the nature of the courage with which I am endowed, what use I intend making of my strength. As for patience, I consider that I have abundantly exercised that in beginning every morning the task of the night before, and every night renewing the task of the day. But then, young man, and I pray of you to give me your full attention, then I thought I could not be doing anything displeasing to the Almighty in trying to set an innocent being at liberty, one who had committed no offense and merited no condemnation."
"And have your notions changed?" asked Dantes with much surprise. "Do you think yourself more guilty in making the attempt since you have encountered me?"
"No, neither do I wish to incur guilt. Hitherto I have fancied myself merely waging war against circumstances, not men. I have thought it no sin to bore through a wall or destroy a staircase, but I cannot so easily persuade myself to pierce a heart or take away a life." A slight noise of surprise escaped Dante's. "Is it possible," said he, "that where your liberty is at stake, you can allow any such scruple to deter you from obtaining it?" "Tell me," replied Faria, "what has hindered you from knocking down your jailer with a piece of wood torn from your bedstead, dressing yourself in his clothes, and endeavoring to escape?" "Simply the fact that the idea never occurred to me," answered Dantes. "Because," said the old man, "the natural repugnance to the commission of such a crime prevented you from thinking it, and so it ever is because in simple and allowable things our natural instincts keep us from deviating from the strict line of duty. The tiger, whose nature teaches him to delight in shedding blood, needs but the sense of smell to show him where his prey is within reach, and by following this instinct, he is able to measure the leap necessary to permit him to spring on his victim. But man, on the contrary, loathes the idea of blood. It is not alone that the laws of social life inspire him with a shrinking dread of taking life. His natural construction and physiological formation." Dantes was confused and silent at this explanation of the thoughts which had unconsciously been working in his mind, or rather soul. For there are two distinct sorts of ideas, those that proceed from the head and those that emanate from the heart. "Since my imprisonment," said Faria, "I have thought over all the most celebrated cases of escape on record. They have rarely been successful. Those that have been crowned with full success have been long meditated upon and carefully arranged. Such, for instance, is the escape of the Duc de Beaufort from the Château de Vincennes, that of the Abbé de Beaucroix from Fort l'Évêque, of Latude from the Bastille. Then there are those for which chance sometimes affords opportunity, and those are the best of all. Let us, therefore, wait patiently for some favorable moment, and when it presents itself, profit by it." "Ah," said Dantes, "you might well endure the tedious delay. You were constantly employed in the task you set yourself, and when weary with toil, you had your hopes to refresh and encourage you." "I assure you," replied the old man, "I did not turn to that source for recreation or support." "What did you do then?" "I wrote or studied." "Were you then permitted the use of pens, ink, and paper?" "Oh, no," answered the abbé. "I had none but what I made for myself." "You made paper, pens, and ink?" "Yes." Dantes gazed with admiration, but he had some difficulty in believing. Faria saw this. "When you pay me a visit in my cell, my young friend," said he, "I will show you an entire work, the fruits of the thoughts and reflections of my whole life, many of them meditated over in the shades of the Colosseum at Rome, at the foot of St. Mark's Column in Venice, and on the borders of the Arno in Florence, little imagining at the time that they would be arranged in order within the walls of the Château d'If. The work I speak of is called A Treatise on the Possibility of a General Monarchy in Italy, and will make one large quarto volume." "And on what have you written all this?" "On two of my shirts. I invented a preparation that makes linen as smooth and as easy to write on as parchment." "You're then a chemist?" "Somewhat. I know Lavoisier, and was the intimate friend of Cabanis." "But for such a work you must have needed books. Had you any?" "I had nearly 5,000 volumes in my library at Rome, but after reading them over many times, I found that with 150 well-chosen books a man possesses, if not a complete summary of all human knowledge, at least all that a man need really know. I devoted 3 years of my life to reading and studying these 150 volumes, till I know them nearly by heart, so that, since I have been in prison, a very slight effort of memory has enabled me to recall their contents as readily as though the pages were open before me. I could recite you the whole of Thucydides, Xenophon, Plutarch, Titus Livius, Tacitus, Strada, Hernandez, Dante, Montaigne, Shakespeare, Spinoza, Machiavelli, and Bossuet. I name only the most important." "You are doubtless acquainted with a variety of languages, so as to have been able to read all these?" Oui, I speak 5 of the modern tongues. That is to say, German, French, Italian, English, and Spanish. By the aid of ancient Greek, I learned modern Greek. I don't speak it so well as I could wish, but I am still trying to improve myself.
Improve yourself, repeated Dantes. Why, how can you manage to do so?
Why, I made a vocabulary of the words I knew, turned, returned, and arranged them so as to enable me to express my thoughts through their medium. I know nearly 1,000 words, which is all that is absolutely necessary, although I believe there are nearly 100,000 in the dictionaries. I cannot hope to be very fluent, but I certainly should have no difficulty in explaining my wants and wishes, and that would be quite as much as I should ever require.
Stronger grew the wonder of Dantes, who almost fancied he had to do with one gifted with supernatural powers. Still hoping to find some imperfection which might bring him down to a level with human beings, he added, "Then if you were not furnished with pens, how did you manage to write the work you speak of?"
"I made myself some excellent ones, which would be universally preferred to all others if once known. You are aware what huge writings are served to us on meager days. Well, I selected the cartilages of the heads of these fishes, and you can scarcely imagine the delight with which I welcome the arrival of each Wednesday, Friday, or Saturday, as affording me the means of increasing my stock of pens, for I will freely confess that my historical labors have been my greatest solace and relief. While retracing the past, I forget the present, and traversing at will the path of history, I cease to remember that I am myself a prisoner."
"But the ink," said Dantes. "Of what did you make your ink?"
"There was formerly a fireplace in my dungeon," replied Faria, "but it was closed up long ere I became an occupant of this prison. Still, it must have been many years in use, for it was thickly covered with a coating of soot. The soot I dissolved in a portion of the wine brought to me every Sunday, and I assure you a better ink cannot be desired. For every important note for which closer attention is required, I pricked one of my fingers and wrote with my own blood."
"And when," asked Dantes, "may I see all of this?"
"Whenever you please," replied the abbe.
"Oh, then let it be directly," exclaimed the young man.
"Follow me, then," said the abbe, as he re-entered the subterranean passage, in which he soon disappeared, followed by Dantes.
Chapter 17. The Abbé's Chamber. After having passed with tolerable ease through the subterranean passage, which, however, did not admit of their holding themselves erect, the two friends reached the further end of the corridor, into which the abbé's cell opened. From that point, the passage became much narrower, and barely permitted one to creep through on hands and knees. The floor of the abbé's cell was paved, and it had been by raising one of the stones in the most obscure corner that Faria had been able to commence the laborious task of which Dantes had witnessed the completion. As he entered the chamber of his friend, Dantes cast around one eager and searching glance in quest of the expected marvels, but nothing more than comment met his view.
"It is well," said the abbé. "We have some hours before us. It is now just a quarter past 12 o'clock.
Instinctively, Dantes turned round to observe by what watch or clock the abbé had been able so accurately to specify the hour.
"Look at this ray of light which enters by my window," said the abbé, "and then observe the lines traced on the wall. Well, by means of these lines, which are in accordance with the double motion of the earth and the eclipse it describes round the sun, I am enabled to ascertain the precise hour with more minuteness than if I possessed a watch, for that might be broken or deranged in its movements, while the sun and earth never vary in their appointed paths."
This last explanation was wholly lost upon Dantes, who had always imagined, from seeing the sun rise from behind the mountains and set in the Mediterranean, that it moved and not the earth. A double movement of the globe he inhabited, and of which he could feel nothing, appeared to him perfectly impossible. Each word that fell from his companion's lips seemed fraught with the mysteries of science, as worthy of digging out as the gold and diamonds in the mines of Gujarat and Golconda,
which he could just recollect having visited during a voyage made in his earliest youth. "Come," said he to the abbé, "I'm anxious to see your treasures." The abbé smiled, and, proceeding to the disused fireplace, raised, by the help of his chisel, a long stone which had doubtless been the hearth, beneath which was a cavity of considerable depth, serving as a safe depository of the articles mentioned to Dantès. "What do you wish to see first?" asked the abbé. "Your great work on the monarchy of Italy." Faria then drew forth from his hiding place 3 or 4 rolls of linen, laid one over the other like folds of papyrus. These rolls consisted of slips of cloth about 4 inches wide and 18 long. They were all carefully numbered and closely covered with writing, so legible that Dantès could easily read it, as well as make out the sense, it being in Italian, a language he, as a Provençal, perfectly understood. "There," said he, "is the work complete. I wrote the word finis at the end of the 68th strip about a week ago. I have torn up 2 of my shirts and as many handkerchiefs as I was master of, to complete the precious pages. Should I ever get out of prison, and find in all Italy a printer courageous enough to publish what I have composed, my literary reputation is forever secured." "I see," answered Dantès. "Now let me behold the curious pens with which you have written your work." "Look," said Faria, showing to the young man a slender stick about 6 inches long, and much resembling the size of the handle of a fine painting brush, to the end of which was tied, by a piece of thread, one of those cartilages of which the abbé had before spoken to Dantès. It was pointed and divided at the nib like an ordinary pen. Dantès examined it with intense admiration, then looked around to see the instrument with which it had been shaped so correctly into form. "Ah, yes," said Faria, "the pen-knife. That is my masterpiece. I made it, as well as this larger knife, out of an old iron candlestick." The penknife was sharp and keen as a razor. As for the other knife, it would serve a double purpose, and with it one could cut and thrust. Dantès examined the various articles shown to him with the same attention that he had bestowed on the curiosities and strange tools exhibited in the shops at Marseilles as the works of the savages in the South Seas, from whence they had been brought by the different trading vessels. "As for the ink," said Faria, "I told you how I managed to obtain it, and I only just make it from time to time as I require it." "One thing still puzzles me," observed Dantès, "and that is how you managed to do all this by daylight?" "I worked at night or so," replied Faria. "Night? Why, for heaven's sake, are your eyes like cats, that you can see to work in the dark?" "Indeed they are not, but God has supplied man with the intelligence that enables him to overcome the limitations of natural conditions. I furnished myself with a light." "You did? Pray tell me how." "I separated the fat from the meat served to me, melted it, and so made oil. Here is my lamp." So saying, the abbé exhibited a sort of torch very similar to those used in public illuminations. "But light?" "Here are 2 flints and a piece of burnt linen." "And matches?" "I pretended that I had a disorder of the skin, and asked for a little sulphur, which was readily supplied." Dantès laid the different things he had been looking at on the table, and stood with his head drooping on his breast, as though overwhelmed by the perseverance and strength of Faria's mind. "You have not seen all yet," continued Faria, "for I did not think it wise to trust all my treasures in the same hiding place. Let us shut this one up." They put the stone back in its place. The abbé sprinkled a little dust over it to conceal the traces of its having been removed, rubbed his foot well on it to make it assume the same appearance as the other, and then, going towards his bed, he removed it from the spot it stood. Behind the head of the bed, and concealed by a stone fitting in so closely as to defy all suspicion, was a hollow space, and in this space a ladder of cords between 25 and 30 feet in length. Dantès closely and eagerly examined it. He found it firm, solid, and compact enough to bear any weight. "Who supplied you with the materials for making this wonderful work?" "I tore up several of my shirts, and ripped out the seams in the sheets of my bed, during my 3 years' imprisonment at Fenestrel. And when I was removed to the Chateau d'If, I managed to bring the ravelings with me, so that I've been able to finish my work here.
And was it not discovered that your sheets were unhemmed?
Oh no, for when I had taken out the thread I required, I hemmed the edges over again.
With what?
With this needle, said the abbe, as, opening his ragged vestments, he showed Dantes a long, sharp fishbone, with a small perforated eye for the thread, a small portion of which still remained in it. I once thought, continued Faria, of removing these iron bars and letting myself down from the window, which, as you see, is somewhat wider than yours, although I should have enlarged it still more preparatory to my flight. However, I discovered that I should merely have dropped into a sort of inner court, and I therefore renounced the project altogether as too full of risk and danger. Nevertheless, I carefully preserved my ladder against one of those unforeseen opportunities of which I spoke just now, and which sudden chance frequently brings about. While affecting to be deeply engaged in examining the ladder, the mind of Dantes was, in fact, busily occupied by the idea that a person so intelligent, ingenious, and clear-sighted as the abbe might probably be able to solve the dark mystery of his own misfortunes, where he himself could see nothing. "What are you thinking of?" asked the abbe smilingly, imputing the deep abstraction in which his visitor was plunged to the excess of his awe and wonder. "I was reflecting, in the first place," replied Dantes, "upon the enormous degree of intelligence and ability you must have employed to reach the high perfection to which you have attained. What would you not have accomplished if you had been free?" "Possibly nothing at all. The overflow of my brain would probably, in a state of freedom, have evaporated in 1,000 follies. Misfortune is needed to bring to light the treasures of the human intellect. Compression is needed to explode the gunpowder. Captivity has brought my mental faculties to a focus, and you are well aware that from the collision of clouds, electricity is produced. From electricity, lightning; from lightning, illumination." "No," replied Dantes, "I know nothing. Some of your words are to me quite empty of meaning. You must be blessed indeed to possess the knowledge you have." The abbe smiled. "Well," said he, "but you had another subject for your thoughts. Did you not say so just now?" "I did." "You have told me as yet but one of them. Let me hear the other." "It was this, that while you had related to me all the particulars of your past life, you were perfectly unacquainted with mine." "Your life, my young friend, has not been of sufficient length to admit of your having passed through any very important events." "It has been long enough to inflict on me a great and undeserved misfortune. I would fain fix the source of it on man, that I may no longer vent reproaches upon heaven." "Then you profess ignorance of the crime for which you are charged?" "I do indeed, and this I swear by the two beings most dear to me upon earth, my father and Mercedes." "Come," said the abbe, closing his hiding place and pushing the bed back to its original situation. "Let me hear your story." Dantes obeyed and commenced what he called his history, but which consisted only of the account of a voyage to India and 2 or 3 voyages to the Levant, until he arrived at the recital of his last cruise, with the death of Captain Leclerc and the receipt of a packet to be delivered by himself to the Grand Marshal. His interview with that person, and his receiving, in place of the packet brought, a letter addressed to a Monsieur Noirtier, his arrival at Marseille, an interview with his father, his affection for Mercedes and their nuptial feast, his arrest and subsequent examination, his temporary detention at the Palais de Justice, and his final imprisonment in the Chateau d'If. From this point, everything was a blank to Dantes. He knew nothing more, not even the length of time he had been imprisoned. His recital finished, the abbe reflected long and earnestly. "There is," said he at the end of his meditations, "a clever maxim which bears upon what I was saying to you some little while ago, and that is, that unless wicked ideas take root in a naturally depraved mind, a human nature, in a right and wholesome state, revolts at crime. Still, from an artificial civilization have originated wants, vices, and false tastes, which occasionally become so powerful as to stifle within us all good feelings, and ultimately to lead us into guilt and wickedness. From this view of things, then comes the axiom that if you visit to discover the author of any bad action, seek first to discover the person to whom the preparation of that bad action could be in any way advantageous. Now, to apply it in your case, to whom could your disappearance have been serviceable? To no one, by heaven. I was a very insignificant person. Do not speak thus, for your reply evinces neither logic nor philosophy. Everything is relative, my dear young friend, from the king who stands in the way of his successor to the employee who keeps his rival out of the place. Now, in the event of the king's death, his successor inherits a crown. When the employee dies, the supernumerary steps into his shoes and receives his salary of 12,000 livres. Well, these 12,000 livres are his civil list and are as essential to him as the 12 millions of a king. Everyone from the highest to the lowest degree has his place on the social ladder and is beset by stormy passions and conflicting interests, as in Descartes' theory of pressure and impulsion. But these forces increase as we go higher, so that we have a spiral which, in defiance of reason, rests upon the apex and not on the base. Now, let us return to your particular world. You say you are on the point of being made captain of the Pharaon? Yeah. And about to become the husband of a young and lovely girl? Yes. Now, could anyone have had any interest in preventing the accomplishment of these two things? But let us settle first the question as to its being the interest of anyone to hinder you from being captain of the Pharaon. What say you? I cannot believe such was the case. I was generally liked on board, and had the sailors possessed the right of selecting a captain themselves, I feel convinced their choice would have fallen on me. There was only one person among the crew who had any feeling of ill will towards me. I had quarreled with him some time previously, and had even challenged him to fight me, but he refused. Now we are getting on. And what was this man's name? Danglars. What rank did he hold on board? He was supercargo. And had you been captain, should you have retained him in his employment? Not if the choice had remained with me, for I had frequently observed inaccuracies in his accounts. Good again. Now then, tell me, was any person present during your last conversation with Captain Leclerc? No, we were quite alone. Could your conversation have been overheard by anyone? It might, for the cabin door was open, and... Stay, now I recollect. Danglars himself passed by just as Captain Leclerc was giving me the packet for the Grand Marshal. That's better, cried the Abbé. Now we are on the right scent. Did you take anybody with you when you put into the port of Elba? Nobody. Somebody there received your packet and gave you a letter to place in it, I think? Yes, the Grand Marshal did. And what did you do with that letter? Put it into my portfolio. You had your portfolio with you then? Now, how could a sailor find room in his pocket for a portfolio large enough to contain an official letter? You're right, it was left on board. Then it was not till your return to the ship that you put the letter in the portfolio? No. And what did you do with the same letter while returning from Porto Frajo to the vessel? I carried it in my hand. So that, when you went on board the Pharaon, everybody could see that you held a letter in your hand. Yes. Danglars, as well as the rest? Danglars, as well as others. Now, listen to me and try to recall every circumstance attending your arrest. Do you recollect the words in which the information against you was formulated? Oh yes, I read it over 3 times, and the words sank deeply into my memory. Repeat it to me. Dantes paused a moment, then said, This is it, word for word. The king's attorney is informed by a friend of the throne and religion that one Edmond Dantes may, on board the Pharaon, this day arrive from Smyrna, after having touched at Naples and Porto Ferrajo, has been entrusted by Murat with a packet for the usurper. Again, by the usurper with a letter for the Bonapartist Club in Paris. This proof of his guilt may be procured by his immediate arrest, as the letter will be found either about his person, at his father's residence, or in his cabin on board the Pharaon. The abbé shrugged his shoulders. "The thing is as clear as day," said he. "And you must have had a very confiding nature, as well as a good heart, not to have suspected the origin of the whole affair." "Do you really think so?" "That would be infamous." "How did Danglars usually write?" "In a handsome running hand." "And how was the anonymous letter written?" "Backhanded." Again the abbé smiled. "Disguised." "It was very boldly written, if disguised." "Stop a bit," said the abbé, taking up what he called his pen, and, after dipping it into the ink, he wrote on a piece of prepared linen, with his left hand, the first 2 or 3 words of the accusation. Dantès drew back, and gazed on the abbé with a sensation almost amounting to terror. "How very astonishing!" cried he at length. "Why, your writing exactly resembles that of the accusation." "Simply because that accusation had been written with the left hand, and I have noticed that." "What?" "That, while writing of different persons done with the right hand varies, that performed with the left hand is invariably uniform." "You've evidently seen and observed everything." "Let us proceed." Yes, yes. Now, as regards the second question." "I'm listening." "Was there any person whose interest it was to prevent your marriage with Mercedes?" "Yes, a young man who loved her." "And his name was?" "Fernand." "That is a Spanish name, I think?" "He was a Catalan." "You imagine him capable of writing the letter?" "Oh, no. He would more likely have got rid of me by sticking a knife into me." "That is in strict accordance with the Spanish character. An assassination they will unhesitatingly commit, but an act of cowardice, never." "Besides," said Dante, "the various circumstances mentioned in the letter were wholly unknown to him." "You have never spoken of them yourself to anyone?" "To no one." "Not even your mistress?" "No, not even to my betrothed." "Then it is Danglars." "I feel quite certain of it now." "Wait a little. Pray, was Danglars acquainted with Fernand?" "No, yes, he was. Now I recollect." "What?" "To have seen them both sitting at table together under an arbor at Pere Pamphilus the evening before the day fixed for my wedding. They were in earnest conversation. Danglars was joking in a friendly way, but Fernand looked pale and agitated." "Were they alone?" "There was a third person with them whom I knew perfectly well, and who had, in all probability, made their acquaintance. He was a tailor named Caderousse, but he was very drunk. Stay. How strange that it should not have occurred to me before. Now I remember quite well that on the table round which they were sitting were pens, ink, and paper." "Heartless, treacherous scoundrels!" exclaimed Dantès, pressing his hand to his throbbing brows. "Is there anything else I can assist you in discovering besides the villainy of your friends?" inquired the abbé. Yes, replied Dantès eagerly. "I would beg of you, who see so completely to the depth of things, and to whom the greatest mystery seems but an easy riddle, to explain to me how it was that I underwent no second examination, was never brought to trial, and, above all, was condemned without ever having had sentence passed on me." "That is altogether a different and more serious matter," responded the abbé. "The ways of justice are frequently too dark and mysterious to be easily penetrated. All we have hitherto done in the matter has been child's play. If you wish me to enter upon the more difficult part of the business, you must assist me by the most minute information on every point." "Pray ask me whatever questions you please, for in good truth you see more clearly into my life than I do myself." "In the first place, then, who examined you? The king's attorney, his deputy, or a magistrate?" "The deputy." Was he young or old? About 6 or 7 and 20 years of age, I should say. So, answered the abbe, old enough to be ambitious, but too young to be corrupt. And how did he treat you? With more of mildness than severity. Did you tell him your whole story? I did. And did his conduct change at all in the course of your examination? He did appear much disturbed when he read the letter that had brought me into this scrape. He seemed quite overcome by my misfortune. By your misfortune? Yes. Then you feel quite sure that it was your misfortune he had deplored? He gave me one great proof of his sympathy, at any rate. And that? He burnt the sole evidence that could have at all incriminated me. What's the accusation? No, the letter. Are you sure? I saw it done. That alters the case. This man might, after all, be a greater scoundrel than you have thought possible. Upon my word, said Dantes, you make me shudder. Is the world filled with tigers and crocodiles? Yes, and remember that two-legged tigers and crocodiles are more dangerous than the others. Never mind. Let us go on. With all my heart. You tell me he burns the letter? He did, saying at the same time, you see I thus destroy the only proof existing against you? This action is somewhat too sublime to be natural. You think so? I am sure of it. To whom was this letter addressed? To Monsieur Noirtier, number 13, Coqueron, Paris. Now, can you conceive of any interest that your heroic deputy could possibly have had in the destruction of that letter? Why, it's not altogether impossible he might have had, for he made me promise several times never to speak of that letter to anyone, assuring me he so advised me for my own interest. And more than this, he insisted on my taking a solemn oath never to utter the name mentioned in the address. Noirtier, replied the abbe. Noirtier. I knew a person of that name at the court of the Queen of Etruria, a Noirtier who had been a Girondin during the Revolution. What was your deputy called? De Villefort. The abbe burst into a fit of laughter, while Dantes gazed on him in utter astonishment. What ails you? Said he at length. Do you see that ray of sunlight? I do. Well, the whole thing is more clear to me than that sunbeam is to you. Poor fellow, poor young man, and you tell me this magistrate expressed great sympathy and commiseration for you? He did. And the worthy man destroyed your compromising letter? Yes. And then made you swear never to utter the name of Noirtier? Yes. Why, you poor short-sighted simpleton, can you not guess who this Noirtier was, whose very name he was so careful to keep concealed? Noirtier was his father. Had a thunderbolt fallen at the feet of Dantes, or hell opened its yawning gulf before him, he could not have been more completely transfixed with horror than he was at the sound of these unexpected words. Starting up, he clasped his hands round his head as though to prevent his very brain from bursting, and exclaimed, His father! His father!
Yes, his father, replied the abbe. His right name was Noirtier de Villefort. At this instant, a bright light shot through the mind of Dantes and cleared up all that had been dark and obscure before. The change that had come over Villefort during the examination, the destruction of the letter, the exacted promise, the almost supplicating tones of the magistrate, who seemed rather to implore mercy than to pronounce punishment, all returned with a stunning force to his memory. He cried out and staggered against the wall like a drunken man. Then he turned to the opening that led from the abbe's cell to his own and said, I must be alone to think over all this. When he regained his dungeon, he threw himself on his bed, where the turnkey found him in the evening visit, sitting with fixed gaze and contracted features, dumb and motionless as a statue. During these hours of profound meditation, which to him had seemed only minutes, he had formed a fearful resolution, and bound himself to its fulfillment by a solemn oath. Dantes was at length roused from his reverie by the voice of Faria, who, having also been visited by his jailer, had come to invite his fellow sufferer to share his supper. The reputation of being out of his mind, though harmlessly and even amusingly so, had procured for the abbé unusual privileges. He was supplied with bread of a finer, wider quality than the usual prison fare, and even regaled each Sunday with a small quantity of wine. Now this was a Sunday, and the abbé had come to ask his young companion to share the luxuries with him. Dantes followed. His features were no longer contracted, and now wore their usual expression, but there was that in his whole appearance that bespoke one who had come to a fixed and desperate resolve. Faria bent on him his penetrating eye. "I regret now," said he, "having helped you in your late inquiries, or having given you the information I did." "Why so?" inquired Dantes. "Because it is instilled a new passion in your heart, that of vengeance." Dante smiled. "Let us talk of something else," said he. Again the abbé looked at him, then mournfully shook his head. But in accordance with Dante's request, he began to speak of other matters. The elder prisoner was one of those persons whose conversation, like that of all who have experienced many trials, contained many useful and important hints as well as sound information. But it was never egotistical, for the unfortunate man never alluded to his own sorrows. Dantes listened with admiring attention to all he had said. Some of his remarks corresponded with what he already knew, or applied to the sort of knowledge his nautical life had enabled him to acquire. A part of the good abbé's words, however, were wholly incomprehensible to him, but, like the aurora which guides the navigator in northern latitudes, opened new vistas to the inquiring mind of the listener, and gave fantastic glimpses of new horizons, enabling him justly to estimate the delight an intellectual mind would have in following one so richly gifted as Faria along the heights of truth where he was so much at home. "You must teach me a small part of what you know," said Dantes, "if only to prevent your growing weary of me. I can well believe that so learned a person as yourself would prefer absolute solitude to being tormented with the company of one as ignorant and uninformed as myself. If you will only agree to my request, I promise you never to mention another word about escaping." The abbé smiled. "Alas, my boy," said he, "human knowledge is confined within very narrow limits, and when I have taught you mathematics, physics, history, and the 3 or 4 modern languages with which I am acquainted, you will know as much as I do myself. Now, it will scarcely require 2 years for me to communicate to you the stock of learning I possess." "2 years?" exclaimed Dantes. "Do you really believe that I can acquire all these things in so short a time?" "Not their application, certainly, but their principles you may. To learn is not to know. There are the learners and the learned. Memory makes the one, philosophy the other." "But cannot one learn philosophy?" "Philosophy cannot be taught. It is the application of the sciences to truth. It is like the golden cloud in which the Messiah went up into heaven." "Well then," said Dantes, "what shall you teach me first? I am in a hurry to begin. I want to learn." "Everything," said the abbé. And that very evening the prisoners sketched a plan of education, to be entered upon the following day. Dantes possessed a prodigious memory, combined with an astonishing quickness and readiness of conception. The mathematical turn of his mind rendered him apt at all kinds of calculation, while his naturally poetical feelings threw a light and pleasing veil over the dry reality of arithmetical computation, or the rigid severity of geometry. He already knew Italian, and had also picked up a little of the Romaic dialect during voyages to the East, and by the aid of these 2 languages he easily comprehended the construction of all the others, so that at the end of 6 months he began to speak Spanish, English, and German. In strict accordance with the promise made to the abbé, Dante spoke no more of escape. Perhaps the delight his studies afforded him left no room for such thoughts. Perhaps the recollection that he had pledged his word, on which his sense of honor was keen, kept him from referring in any way to the possibilities of flight. Days, even months, passed by unheeded in one rapid and instructive course. At the end of a year, Dantes was a new man. Dantes observed, however, that Faria, in spite of the relief his society afforded, daily grew sadder. One thought seemed incessantly to harass and distract his mind. Sometimes he would fall into long reveries, sighed heavily and involuntarily, then suddenly rise and, with folded arms, begin pacing the confined space of his dungeon. One day he stopped all at once and exclaimed, "Ah, if there was no sentinel!" "There shall not be one a minute longer than you please," said Dantes, who had followed the working of his thoughts as accurately as though his brain were enclosed in crystal, so clear as to display its minutest operations. "I have already told you," answered the abbé, "that I loathe the idea of shedding blood." "And yet the murder, if you choose to call it so, would be simply a measure of self-preservation." "No matter. I could never agree to it." "Still, you have thought of it." "Incessantly, alas!" cried the abbé. "And you have discovered a means of regaining our freedom, have you not?" asked Dantes eagerly. "I have. If it were only possible to place a deaf and blind sentinel in the gallery beyond us." "He shall be both blind and deaf," replied the young man, with an air of determination that made his companion shudder. "No, no," cried the abbé. "Impossible." Dantes endeavored to renew the subject. The abbé shook his head in token of disapproval, and refused to make any further response. 3 months passed away. "Are you strong?" the abbé asked one day of Dantes. The young man, in reply, took up the chisel, bent it into the form of a horseshoe, and then as readily straightened it. "And will you engage not to do any harm to the sentry except as a last resort?" "I promise on my honor." "Then," said the abbé, "we may hope to put our design into execution." "And how long shall we be in accomplishing the necessary work?" "At least a year." "And shall we begin at once?" "At once." "We have lost a year to no purpose," cried Dantes. "Do you consider the last 12 months to have been wasted?" asked the abbé. "Forgive me," cried Edmund, blushing deeply. "Tch," answered the abbé. "Man is but man after all, and you are about the best specimen of the genus I have ever known. Come, let me show you my plan." The abbé then showed Dantes the sketch he had made for their escape. It consisted of a plan of his own cell and that of Dantes, with the passage which united them. In this passage he proposed to drive a level as they do in mines. This level would bring the 2 prisoners immediately beneath the gallery where the sentry kept watch. Once there, a large excavation would be made, and one of the flagstones with which the gallery was paved be so completely loosened that at the desired moment it would give way beneath the feet of the soldier, who, stunned by his fall, would be immediately bound and gagged by Dantes before he had power to offer any resistance. The prisoners were then to make their way through one of the gallery windows, and to let themselves down from the outer walls by means of the abbé's ladder of cords. Dantes' eyes sparkled with joy, and he rubbed his hands with delight at the idea of a plan so simple, yet apparently so certain to succeed. That very day the miners began their labors, with a vigor and alacrity proportionate to their long rest from fatigue and their hopes of ultimate success. Nothing interrupted the progress of the work except the necessity that each was under of returning to his own cell in anticipation of the turnkey's visits. They had learned to distinguish the almost imperceptible sound of his footsteps as he descended towards their dungeons, and happily never failed of being prepared for his coming. The fresh earth excavated during their present work, and which would have entirely blocked up the old passage, was thrown by degrees and with the utmost precaution out of the window in either Faria's or Dantes' cell, the rubbish being first pulverized so finely that the night wind carried it far away without permitting the smallest trace to remain. More than a year had been consumed in this undertaking, the only tools for which had been a chisel, a knife, and a wooden lever. Faria still continuing to instruct Dantes by conversing with him, sometimes in one language, sometimes in another, at others relating to him the history of nations and great men who from time to time have risen to fame and trodden the path of glory. The abbé was a man of the world, and, moreover, mixed in the society of his day. He wore an air of melancholy dignity which Dante's, thanks to the imitative powers bestowed on him by nature, easily acquired, as well as that outward polish and politeness he had before been wanting in, and which is seldom possessed except by those who have been placed in constant intercourse with persons of high birth and breeding. At the end of 15 months the level was finished, and the excavation completed beneath the gallery, and the two workmen could distinctly hear the measured tread of the sentinel as he paced to and fro over their heads. Compelled as they were to await a night sufficiently dark to favor their flight, they were obliged to defer their final attempt till that auspicious moment should arrive. Their greatest dread now was lest the stone through which the century was doomed to fall should give way before its right time, and this they had in some measure provided against by propping it up with a small beam which they had discovered in the walls through which they had worked their way. Dantes was occupied in arranging this piece of wood when he heard Faria, who had remained in Edmund's cell for the purpose of cutting a peg to secure their rope ladder, call to him in a tone indicative of great suffering. Dantes hastened to his dungeon, where he found him standing in the middle of the room, pale as death, his forehead streaming with perspiration, and his hands clenched tightly together. "Gracious heavens!" exclaimed Dantes. "What's the matter? What has happened?" "Quick, quick," returned the abbé. "Listen to what I have to say." Dantes looked in fear and wonder at the livid countenance of Faria, whose eyes, already dull and sunken, were surrounded by purple circles, while his lips were white as those of a corpse, and his very hair seemed to stand on end. "Tell me, I beseech you, what ails you?" cried Dantes, letting his chisel fall to the floor. "Alas," faltered the abbé, "all is over with me. I am seized with a terrible, perhaps mortal illness. I can feel that the paroxysm is fast approaching. I had a similar attack the year previous to my imprisonment. This malady admits but of one remedy. I will tell you what that is. Go into my cell as quickly as you can. Draw out one of the feet that supports the bed. You will find it has been hollowed out for the purpose of containing a small phial you will see there half filled with a red-looking fluid. Bring it to me, or rather, no, I may be found here. Therefore, help me back to my room while I have the strength to drag myself along. Who knows what may happen, or how long the attack may last?" In spite of the magnitude of the misfortune which thus suddenly frustrated his hopes, Dantes did not lose his presence of mind, but descended into the passage, dragging his unfortunate companion with him. Then, half carrying, half supporting him, he managed to reach the abbé's chamber, when he immediately laid the sufferer on his bed. "Thanks," said the poor abbé, shivering as though his veins were filled with ice. "I am about to be seized with a fit of catalepsy. When it comes to its height, I shall probably lie still and motionless as though dead, uttering neither a sigh nor groan. On the other hand, the symptoms may be much more violent, and cause me to fall into fearful convulsions, foam at the mouth, and cry out loudly. Take care my cries are not heard, for if they are, it is more than probable I should be removed to another part of the prison, and we be separated forever. When I become motionless, cold and rigid as a corpse then, and not before, be careful about this. Force open my teeth with our knife, pour from 8 to 10 drops of the liquor contained in the phial down my throat, and I may perhaps revive." "Perhaps?" exclaimed Dantes in grief-stricken tones. "Help! Help!" cried the abbé. I die, So sudden and violent was the fit that the unfortunate prisoner was unable to complete the sentence. A violent convulsion shook his whole frame. His eyes started from their sockets. His mouth was drawn on one side. His cheeks became purple. He struggled, foamed, dashed himself about, and uttered the most dreadful cries, which, however, Dantes prevented from being heard by covering his head with the blanket. The fit lasted 2 hours. Then, more helpless than an infant, and colder and paler than marble, more crushed and broken than a reed trampled underfoot, he fell back, doubled up in one last convulsion, and became as rigid as a corpse. Edmund waited till life seemed extinct in the body of his friend. Then, taking up the knife, he with difficulty forced open the closely fixed jaws, carefully administered the appointed number of drops, and anxiously awaited the result. An hour passed away, and the old man gave no sign of returning animation. Dantes began to fear he had delayed too long ere he administered the remedy, and, thrusting his hands into his hair, continued gazing on the lifeless features of his friend. At length, a slight color tinged the livid cheeks. Consciousness returned to the dull, open eyeballs. A faint sigh issued from the lips, and the sufferer made a feeble effort to move. "He's saved! He's saved!" cried Dantes in a paroxysm of delight. The sick man was not yet able to speak, but he pointed with evident anxiety towards the door. Dantes listened, and plainly distinguished the approaching steps of the jailer. It was therefore near 7 o'clock, but Edmund's anxiety had put all thoughts of time out of his head. The young man sprang to the entrance, darted through it, carefully drawing the stone over the opening, and hurried to his cell. He had scarcely done so before the door opened, and the jailer saw the prisoner seated as usual on the side of his bed. Almost before the key had turned in the lock, and before the departing steps of the jailer had died away in the long corridor he had to traverse, Dantes, whose restless anxiety concerning his friend left him no desire to touch the food brought him, hurried back to the abbé's chamber, and raising the stone by pressing his head against it, was soon beside the sick man's couch. Faria had now fully regained his consciousness, but he still lay helpless and exhausted. "I did not expect to see you again," said he feebly to Dantes. "And why not?" asked the young man. "Did you fancy yourself dying?" "No, I had no such idea, but knowing that all was ready for flight, I thought you might have made your escape." The deep glow of indignation suffused the cheeks of Dantes. "Without you? Did you really think me capable of that?" "At least," said the abbé, "I now see how wrong such an opinion would have been. Alas, alas, I am fearfully exhausted and debilitated by this attack." "Be of good cheer," replied Dantes. "Your strength will return." And as he spoke, he seated himself near the bed beside Faria and took his hands. The abbé shook his head. "The last attack I had," said he, "lasted but half an hour, and after it I was hungry and got up without help. Now I can move neither my right arm nor my leg, and my head seems uncomfortable, which shows that there has been a suffusion of blood on the brain. The third attack will either carry me off or leave me paralyzed for life." "No, no," cried Dantes. "You're mistaken. You will not die. And your third attack, if indeed you should have another, will find you at liberty. We shall save you another time, as we have done this, only with a better chance of success, because we shall be able to command every requisite assistance." "My good Edmond," answered the abbé, "be not deceived. The attack which has just passed away condemns me forever to the walls of a prison. None can fly from a dungeon who cannot walk." "Well, we will wait. A week, a month, 2 months if need be, and meanwhile your strength will return. Everything is in readiness for our flight, and we can select any time we choose. As soon as you feel able to swim, we will go." "I shall never swim again," replied Faria. "This arm is paralyzed, not for a time, but forever. Lift it, and judge if I am mistaken." The young man raised the arm, which fell back by its own weight, perfectly inanimate and helpless. A sigh escaped him. "You are convinced now, Edmond, are you not?" asked the abbé. "Depend upon it, I know what I say. Since the first attack I experienced of this malady, I have continually reflected upon it. Indeed, I expect it, for it is a family inheritance. Both my father and grandfather died of it in a third attack. The physician who prepared for me the remedy I have twice successfully taken was no other than the celebrated Cabanilles, and he predicted a similar end for me." "The physician may be mistaken," exclaimed Dantes. "And as for your poor arm, what difference will that make? I can take you on my shoulders and swim for both of us." "My son," said the abbé, "you, who are a sailor and swimmer, must know as well as I do that a man so loaded would sink before he had done 50 strokes. Cease, then, to allow yourself to be duped by vain hopes that even your own excellent art refuses to believe in. Here I shall remain till the hour of my deliverance arrives, and that in all human probability will be the hour of my death. As for you, who are young and active, delay not on my account, but fly, go. I give you back your promise." "It is well," said Dantes. "Then I shall also remain." Then, rising and extending his hand with an air of solemnity over the old man's head, he slowly added, "By the blood of Christ, I swear never to leave while you live." Faria gazed fondly on his noble-minded, single-hearted, high-principled young friend, and read in his countenance ample confirmation of the sincerity of his devotion and the loyalty of his purpose. "Thanks," murmured the invalid, extending one hand. "I accept. You may one of these days reap the reward of your disinterested devotion. But as I cannot, and you will not, quit this place, it becomes necessary to fill up the excavation beneath the soldier's gallery. He might, by chance, hear the hollow sound of his footsteps and call the attention of his officer to the circumstance. That would bring about a discovery which would inevitably lead to our being separated. Go then, and set about this work, in which, unhappily, I can offer you no assistance. Keep at it all night, if necessary, and do not return here tomorrow till the jailer has visited me. I shall have something of the greatest importance to communicate to you." Dantes took the hand of the abbé in his, and affectionately pressed it. Faria smiled encouragingly on him, and the young man retired to his task, in the spirit of obedience and respect which he had sworn to show towards his aged friend.
And cut. That's a wrap, folks. Thanks for listening to today's episode of I've Been Meaning to Read That, with me, your host, Dan. If you want to learn more about the show, you can follow us on Instagram at Meaning to Read and TikTok at I've Been Meaning. If you want to support the show to help keep it going, you can find me on Venmo at Dingus Donut, DINGUSDONUT. Supporters get a shout out on the show, and even more important, get to vote on the next book that we read. No matter what, I'll see you for our next episode. Until then, read those books you've been meaning to read, and have a lovely, lovely day.